The first crack in my perfect life wasn't a quake. It was a hairline fracture, so fine I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. It began with the small things, the details a wife notices in the quiet landscape of a shared life. The late-night text that made his phone glow on the nightstand, followed by the too-quick flip to silence. The new cologne, sharp and unfamiliar, that clung to his shirt collars. Unexplained charges on our joint account, a lavish dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of, a delicate gold bracelet from a boutique far across town. Client entertainment, he'd say with a wave of his hand when I asked. A bonus for Alina for her hard work, he'd explain about the bracelet, his voice smooth as polished stone. Alina, our live-in maid, young, pretty, with a shy smile that never quite reached her eyes when I was in the room. My heart, that foolish, loyal organ, clenched into a cold fist in my chest, but I brushed it off. I was Isadora Vance, wife of a respected architect, curator of a beautiful home, a woman who had everything. Paranoia was for women with less to lose. But the gnawing doubt, a persistent, whispering rodent in the dark of my mind, wouldn't leave. It fed on the averted glances, the new secretive password on his laptop, the way he'd take phone calls in the garden, his laughter a little too bright, a little too free. I started watching them, the way they moved around each other in our home, a dance of casual proximity that felt anything but casual. The air in the room would shift when they were both in it, charged with a silent current I was not a part of. I was becoming a ghost in my own house, haunting the periphery of my own life. Little did I know, the first seed of chaos had already been planted. The phone became his mistress before she did. It was a sleek black extension of his hand, a vault of secrets he guarded with a newfound vigilance. It started buzzing at odd hours, during our daughter's piano recital, in the middle of a family dinner with his parents, once at 2:17 a.m. He'd jolt awake, fumble for it in the dark, and hiss a quiet "I can't talk" before slipping out of bed and into the hallway, his voice a low, intimate murmur I could feel more than hear. Each emergency at the site, or international client in a different time zone, sounded plausible on its own. Marcus was a successful man, his work was demanding. But my intuition, that ancient, primal part of me, screamed a single, piercing note: betrayal. I began to track the patterns. The calls always happened when I was in the shower or engrossed in a book or putting our daughter, Leela, to bed. He'd retreat to his study, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a slap. One evening, I pretended to be asleep. I watched through slitted eyes as the blue glow of his screen illuminated his face. He was smiling, a soft, private smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. His thumbs flew across the screen, and then he did something that stole the air from my lungs. He held the phone to his chest, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply, as if savoring a moment. He wasn't dealing with a structural engineer. He was communing with a ghost. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the ghost had a face, and it was living under our roof. Fate, or perhaps karma, is rarely subtle. It was a Tuesday morning, drenched in bland, ordinary sunlight. Marcus had left his phone on the kitchen counter, charging while he went to retrieve files from his car. He'd become so comfortable in his deception, so arrogant in his double life, that his guard had slipped. The phone, this portal to his truth, sat there, vibrating once, then again. A text notification lit up the screen. I didn't move. I was frozen, a statue holding a dish rag. But then another notification came, and another, a rapid, frantic succession. Something was happening. My feet carried me to the counter before my mind could protest. The screen showed a name I didn't recognize, M. Silva, but it was the preview of the messages that turned my blood to ice. M. Silva, you can't just leave me like this, not after last night. M. Silva, she doesn't understand you like I do. She doesn't make you feel the way I do. Face blowing a kiss. M. Silva, is the old witch watching you, face with tears of joy. The last one was accompanied by a voice message icon. My hand, trembling, reached out. I hit play and held the phone to my ear. Her voice, Alina's voice, stripped of its professional meekness, filled my head, laced with intimate, mocking laughter. Come on, Amber, tell me you miss me. I know you do. My stomach dropped. The world tilted on its axis. The floor beneath my feet felt insubstantial. The reality I had been desperately trying to rationalize away hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't paranoid. I was a fool. The carefully constructed walls of my life, painted in the colors of trust and security, crumbled into dust around me. The affair was real, and the betrayal was being orchestrated not in a distant hotel, but in the very heart of my home, over my morning coffee. The initial, white-hot urge to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, to storm into the garden where Alina was quietly dusting the patio furniture and tear her hair out by its roots. It was a tsunami of raw emotion. But as I stood there, the cold granite of the countertop seeping into my palms, a different instinct took hold. A colder, quieter, more terrifying one. If I confronted him now, with nothing but a text and a voice message, he would lie. He would spin a story about a clingy, delusional employee. He would gaslight me, make me feel crazy, and then he would simply become more careful. He would win, and I would be left with nothing but my righteous anger and a shattered heart. No, that was not enough. My exterior became a mask of calm, a placid lake hiding the raging tempest beneath. I went about my day. I made lunch. I helped Leela with her homework. I smiled at my husband when he came back in, files in hand, completely oblivious. But inside, a storm was brewing and I was its architect. I decided to watch, to wait, to become a student of their betrayal. I started noting the times they found themselves alone. I observed the subtle language of their bodies, the brush of his hand against her lower back as he passed her in the hallway, the way her eyes followed him around a room. I began to plan. Revenge, I realized, was not a crime of passion. It was a patient, meticulous art form. I would not act impulsively. I would gather my evidence, brick by painful brick, until I had built an impregnable fortress of truth. And then, only then, when he felt the most secure, would I bring it all crashing down upon him. The tension in the house became a living entity, a third person in our marriage. It thickened the air, made every casual conversation feel like a loaded gun. I played my part perfectly, the trusting, slightly distracted wife. But I was always watching, my senses heightened to a painful degree. The explosion happened on a Friday evening. Leela was at a sleepover. The house was too quiet. I came downstairs for a glass of water and found them in the kitchen. They weren't kissing. They weren't even touching. But the space between them was electric, intimate. He was leaning against the refrigerator, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking down at her with a soft, familiar smile. She was standing close, too close, looking up at him, her head tilted in a way that was both submissive and possessive. They were sharing a moment, a private joke in the heart of my asterisk home. I froze in the doorway. My mind screamed, "Say something, scream, throw the glass," but my body was locked in place. My hands, empty of the glass I'd come for, only clenched into white-knuckled fists at my sides, my nails digging half-moons into my palms. The pain was an anchor, tethering me to my resolve. Marcus saw me first. His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of startled guilt that was quickly schooled into bland neutrality. "Isadora, we were just discussing the grocery list for next week." Alina took a quick step back, her eyes darting to the floor, but not before I saw it, not guilt, but a flicker of annoyance at the interruption. And that's when the twist hit. It wasn't his lie that struck me. It was the realization that this was just the surface. This brazen intimacy in my own kitchen was merely the tip of an iceberg, and its hidden mass was what would truly sink me. The affair was one thing, but what else was he hiding in the shadows he shared with her? The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. The silence in the kitchen stretched, thin and brittle as ice. I watched the play of emotions on my husband's face, the initial panic, the swift calculation, the final settling on a veneer of irritated innocence. But it was Alina who broke the standoff. She didn't scurry away in shame. She didn't stammer an apology. Instead, she lifted her chin, and a slow, deliberate smirk touched the corners of her mouth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance, a silent declaration of victory. She looked from Marcus, who was now avoiding my gaze, back to me, and in that smirk she said everything. "I have him. You don't. This is my territory now." Marcus, emboldened by her audacity or perhaps crushed by his own cowardice, found his voice. "Is there a problem, darling?" he asked, his tone dripping with a false, casual air. He then made his fatal mistake. He waved a hand toward Alina. "Alina was just reminding me we're out of the imported coffee you like. Weren't you, Alina?" The collusion was so blatant it was breathtaking. They were a team, and I was the inconvenient outsider. My blood boiled, a hot, corrosive wave of fury that threatened to shatter my carefully constructed calm. I wanted to launch myself across the room, to wipe that smirk off her face with my own hands. But I didn't. My hands, still clenched at my sides, slowly relaxed. A strange, unnatural calm descended over me. I could feel the hard, rectangular shape of my own phone in the pocket of my robe. Without breaking eye contact with my husband, I slipped my hand into the pocket, my fingers finding the record button by muscle memory. I let the red light glow, a silent witness to their treachery. "No," I said, my voice eerily steady. "No problem at all, I just came down for water." I walked to the sink, filled a glass, and turned to leave, the weight of the recording in my pocket feeling heavier than any weapon. I had captured it. The smirk, the lie, the united front against me. It was no longer my word against theirs. It was evidence. Upstairs, in the sanctuary of my walk-in closet, I leaned against the cool, polished door and finally let the tremors take me. They were not tremors of fear, but of rage, a seismic energy that needed direction. I played back the recording, his dismissive tone, her smug, silent smirk perfectly audible in the tension. This was no longer about saving a marriage, it was a corpse rotting in the foundation of my home. This was about survival. Revenge, I understood then, doesn't rush. It simmers. It calculates. It demands a price for every stolen moment, for every broken promise. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face in the dark. My research began not with passion, but with cold, clinical precision. I researched DNA testing, the different companies, their accuracy, their legal standing. A plan, dark and elegant, began to form in my mind. It wasn't just about exposing the affair. It was about exposing the entire rotten structure he had built. I needed to trace every hidden clue. I started with our finances, creating a shadow spreadsheet of every unexplained expense over the last year. The bracelet, the dinners, the mysterious cash withdrawals. I cross-referenced them with dates, with Marcus's claimed whereabouts, with times Alina had requested odd days off. The pattern was a map of their secret life. I began gathering proof like an archivist of my own demise. Saved text logs, gained from a synced iPad he'd forgotten about, duplicate credit card statements, the damning audio recording. Every piece was a brick. I was building a case, not for a lawyer in a courtroom, but for the court of his own life. I would present him with such an overwhelming mountain of truth that his lies would have nowhere to hide. Every move was calculated, every step taken in utter silence. I was a ghost in the machine of his life, and I was about to cause a fatal system error. The following weeks transformed me into a nocturnal creature, a hunter in the dark. While Marcus slept the untroubled sleep of the guilty, I was awake, the blue light of my laptop my only companion. I dug through years of digital detritus, my heart hardening with each new discovery. The depth of the betrayal was astonishing, a vast, hidden continent of deceit I had never known existed. It wasn't just the affair. The affair was the glittering, disgusting surface. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of financial treachery. I found secret accounts, ones he had meticulously hidden from me. There were transfers, not huge sums, but consistent, telling drips to an account under the name Maria Silva. Alina's real name. He was paying her, funding her life, our money flowing from our joint account into her pockets. There were receipts for hotel stays in our very city, for weekend trips to nearby vineyards, all on days he had told me he was at a conference or on a stressful site inspection. He had created a parallel life, a shadow marriage funded by my naivety. I felt a sickening jolt when I found the emails. A separate account, of course, pet names. My little sparrow for her. My starlight. He called me Izzy, or in recent years, nothing at all. They discussed me, mocked me. In one, she wrote, "When will you leave the old witch? I can't stand playing servant in my own house much longer." Her own house. The audacity was a physical blow. He had not only betrayed me, he had allowed her to see our home, my life, as something she was entitled to. He had created a monster with my own resources, and together they were quietly poisoning the very foundation of everything I held dear. The final, most chilling piece of the puzzle clicked into place one night as I was reviewing photos on his cloud storage. There were dozens of Leela, our daughter, but I noticed with a creeping dread that he had a separate, hidden album. In it were pictures of Alina, but also a little boy. A boy with dark, curly hair and familiar eyes. He was maybe 2 years old. The photos were dated over the last year. In one, Marcus was holding him, his face alight with a joy I hadn't seen in years. The caption, just one word, "Matteo." My blood ran cold. The world narrowed to that single, horrifying image. A child. He had a child with her. The affair wasn't a fling, it was a family. The DNA test was no longer just a strategic move, it was a necessity. The next morning, I approached him with a performance of vulnerable wifehood I deserved an award for. "Marcus," I began, my voice laced with manufactured worry. "With all the genetic testing kits these days and Leela's history of asthma, I've been thinking, maybe we should get a full DNA workup for her, just to be sure of any hereditary risks for her future." I held my breath. He looked up from his newspaper, his eyes guarded. I saw the flicker of panic quickly masked. "Is that necessary? It seems like an invasion of privacy," he said, his tone dismissive. "It would give me peace of mind," I pressed, letting my lip tremble slightly. "Please." For me, he studied me for a long moment, looking for a trap. Seeing only a concerned, slightly paranoid wife, he reluctantly nodded. "Fine, if it will make you feel better." He had just sanctioned the instrument of his own destruction. That tiny, seemingly innocent action, that swab of our daughter's cheek, would detonate the most carefully built of his lies. The 2 weeks that followed were an exercise in exquisite torture. The kit was sent. The samples were received. Every day, the anxiety was a living thing coiled in my stomach, tightening with each passing hour. I moved through my life like an automaton, smiling at PTA meetings, discussing paint swatches for the living room, all while my mind was screaming a single, terrifying question. What will the test reveal? Would it simply confirm Leela was his, making my other evidence the sole foundation of my case? Or would it uncover something even more shocking, something I had only allowed myself to fear in the deepest, darkest hours of the night? I watched him with new eyes. Did he look at Leela and see a reflection of himself, or did he see a question mark? He went about his life, oblivious to the sword of Damocles hanging over his head by the thin thread of a laboratory's analysis. He was still meeting Alina, still funding her life, still playing house. The arrogance was staggering. The waiting was a crucible. It burned away the last of my hope, the last of my love, leaving behind a core of pure, hardened resolve. I used the time to fortify my position. I met with a lawyer, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Diana, and laid out my evidence. She smiled a thin, predatory smile. "This," she said, tapping the file, "is a masterpiece." The anxiety didn't leave me, but it was joined by a steely certainty. The results, whatever they were, would be the first domino to fall. And I was ready to watch the entire, carefully constructed facade of Marcus Vance come crashing down. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. "Your results are ready." The words were simple, black and white, but they felt like a seismic event. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. I didn't open it, not yet. This moment was too powerful to experience alone in the glow of my laptop. This required a stage. I waited until I knew he was in his home office, on a call he couldn't easily escape. Then I printed the single, damning page. The paper was warm from the printer, humming with potential energy. I walked to his study, the document held loosely in my hand. I didn't knock. I opened the door and stood there, silent, until his impatient "I'm on a call" died in his throat. He took in my expression, my posture, the paper. His eyes narrowed. "What's this, Isadora? I'm busy." I said nothing. I simply closed the door behind me with a soft, definitive click. The room was filled with the tense silence of a held breath. I could see the gears turning in his head, the slow-dawning realization that this was not a casual interruption. This was a confrontation. I was calm, my spine straight, my breathing even. But my eyes, I let him see the flames there. I let him see the cold, unforgiving fire of a woman who had been pushed too far. He squirmed in his leather chair, the authority he usually wielded in this room melting away under the weight of my silent, accusatory gaze. The power had shifted. He was no longer the architect in control of his domain. He was a man waiting for a verdict. The envelope had felt heavy, but this single sheet of paper was infinitely heavier. It felt like it carried the weight of my entire marriage, my past, and my future, all condensed into lines of data and probability. My name, Leela's name, his name, and then the results. I had braced for the worst, for the shattering revelation that the little girl I had raised, the center of my universe, was not my husband's biological child. But the truth was different. It was more complex, more insidiously cruel. The report stated with 99.9% certainty that Marcus Vance was the biological father of Leela Vance. A wave of relief so potent it made me dizzy washed over me, followed immediately by a new, more profound wave of fury. He was her father. He had a daughter who adored him, a child he had held and loved for 8 years. And yet he had created another child. He had split his life, his loyalty, his fatherhood. He had given another woman a son while still sharing a bed and a home with me. The betrayal was no longer just about sex or stolen moments. It was a fundamental fracture of his role as a father and a husband. He had diluted our family's sanctity, building a secret, competing branch on our family tree. The paper in my hand wasn't just a DNA test. It was a map of his duplicity, proving he was capable of maintaining two separate, full-time lives. He watched me, his initial irritation giving way to a nervous curiosity. "Isadora, what is that?" he asked again, his voice tighter now. My hand, holding the results, didn't shake. I had passed through the storm of emotion and arrived at a place of absolute, crystalline calm. I didn't answer him. I let the silence stretch, let it become a physical presence in the room. I let him anticipate, let his mind race through the possibilities. Was it about Leela's health? Was it some other secret I'd uncovered? I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes as the worst-case scenarios played out behind them. He was vulnerable, completely in the dark, while I stood bathed in the blinding light of the truth. This moment was mine. Every second of doubt I had endured, every tear I had swallowed, every sleepless night spent piecing together his lies, they all culminated in this exquisite, painful silence. I was no longer the victim waiting for an explanation. I was the judge, and he was the condemned, waiting to hear his sentence. I held the power, and I wielded it not by shouting, but by saying nothing at all. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and measured, each word a carefully placed stone. "It's Leela's DNA report." I saw the momentary, foolish flash of relief on his face. He thought it was about medical concerns. That was his world, superficial problems with simple solutions. Then I continued. "It confirms you are her biological father." I paused, letting that fact settle. His brow furrowed in confusion. "Of course I am." "What did you think?" I cut him off, my gaze locking with his, unblinking. "It's good to have confirmation, especially since you seem to be building quite the collection of children." The color drained from his face. The arrogance, the smug superiority, it crumbled like ash. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The revelation wasn't that he wasn't Leela's father. The revelation was that I knew Asterisk. I knew about the other child. I knew about the second family. The secret he had buried in the shadows was now exposed in the bright, unforgiving light of his own study. But that's when karma stepped in. And it did, in the form of his own panic, his own terrified realization that the web of lies he had woven was now entangling him completely. He staggered back a step, his hand flying out to grip the edge of his desk for support. The facade of the confident, successful architect shattered, revealing a weak, cornered man. A torrent of emotions flashed across his face, shock, then denial, then a sickening wave of fear. "Isadora, it's not what you think," he stammered, the words hollow and pathetic. She trapped me. It was a mistake." Betrayal, lies, and deception were laid bare between us, not just in my knowing, but in his pathetic, cowardly response. He wasn't taking responsibility, he was blaming her. He was trying to paint himself as the victim. I stood firm, unstoppable, unshaken. I didn't react to his excuses. I simply watched him unravel, a silent monument to the consequences of his own actions. His emotional collapse was more damning than any confession. It was the admission of guilt written in the tremor of his hands and the desperation in his eyes. The man I had married was gone, and in his place was a stranger whose true, feeble character was finally exposed. I did not scream the truth from the rooftops. I did not send a mass, hysterical email. I wielded the truth like a surgeon's scalpel, not a butcher's cleaver. I began with my older sister, Alara, the one person whose judgment was as sharp as her compassion was deep. I invited her for coffee, and when she saw my face, she knew the social pleasantries were over. "It's Marcus, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. I simply slid the DNA results and a single printed photo of Marcus with the little boy, Matteo, across the table. I watched her face, saw the initial confusion morph into dawning horror, then settle into a cold, protective fury. She reached for my hand, her grip firm. "What do you need?" she asked. That was all. Next was Marcus's mother, Alina, a woman who prized family name and appearance above all else. I met her at her pristine, silent home. I presented the facts without embellishment. The affair, the secret child, the financial support siphoned from our family. I showed her no emotion, only the cold, hard evidence. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She went very still, her face a mask of porcelain, but I saw the minute crack, the flicker of devastating shame in her eyes. The family members I told were carefully chosen, the influential, the loyal, the ones whose opinions Marcus secretly feared. With each quiet revelation, a shockwave pulsed through the foundation of his world. The hidden life he'd created was collapsing not in a noisy, public spectacle, but in the hushed, horrified silence of his own living room, under the disappointed gaze of his own mother. The judgment he would face from his family would be a quiet, relentless, eternal thing. The affair and the love child were merely the flags flying atop the fortress of his deceit. As my lawyer, Diana, and I dug deeper, we uncovered the true fortifications, the layers of financial ruin and manipulation he had constructed to maintain his double life. It wasn't just the secret accounts for Alina. It was the second mortgage he had taken out on our home, a home I believed was nearly paid off. It was the massive loans against his 401k, loans taken under the guise of business investments that had mysteriously failed. He had not just been emotionally unfaithful, he had been financially gutting our shared future to fund his alternative present. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. He had created a house of cards, with our family's financial security as the shaky table it was built upon. The hidden secret wasn't just the other woman and the other child. It was the quiet, systematic poisoning of our financial well-being. The lies were a cancer, and they had metastasized far beyond the bedroom, reaching into every contract, every bank statement, every plan for the future we had ever made. He had been quietly dismantling our life, brick by financial brick, all while smiling across the dinner table. I did not need to scream to be heard. On the day the divorce papers were served to him at his office, a carefully crafted, factual press release was distributed to a short list of key business journals and society bloggers. It contained no salacious details, no emotional language. It simply stated that Isadora Vance was filing for divorce due to irreconcilable differences, and that, as part of the proceedings, it had been discovered that Mr. Vance had significant, previously undisclosed personal liabilities and had engaged in conduct unbecoming of his position on several charitable boards, from which he was therefore resigning, effective immediately. It was a masterstroke of quiet devastation. There were no accusations of infidelity, but the phrase, previously undisclosed personal liabilities, and conduct unbecoming did all the whispering for me. The business world abhors uncertainty and scandal. The phone in his office began to ring off the hook, not with support, but with worried investors and furious board members. The society pages, which had once chronicled our perfect life, now ran subtle items about his sudden resignations. I had not attacked. I had simply revealed facts, calmly and precisely, like a storm arriving without a whisper of wind, and the landscape of his reputation was forever altered. Alina, or Maria Silva, had been operating under the arrogant assumption that her youth and his protection made her untouchable. She didn't expect the cold, hard reality of the law. She was served with a subpoena, compelling her to a deposition. In that sterile, windowless room, seated across from my implacable lawyer, Diana, her bravado evaporated. Diana didn't yell. She simply laid out the evidence. The financial records of the money transfers, the paper trail of the apartment Marcus rented for her, the photos, the timeline that proved his paternity of her son. She presented the lawsuit for the return of all marital funds misappropriated for her benefit. Alina's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. This wasn't a catfight. This was a financial and legal evisceration. The carefully constructed fantasy of someday replacing me, of living a life funded by my husband, shattered against the unyielding wall of the law. Her confession wasn't dramatic. It was a desperate, weeping capitulation, a frantic attempt to minimize her own liability. She gave Diana everything, dates, details, the depth of their financial scheming. My patience and my plan had not just outsmarted her arrogance, they had legally annihilated her position. Demanded to see me one last time. He tried every tactic in the manipulator's handbook. First, the angry, wounded pride. How could you do this to me, to our family, the public humiliation? I said nothing, just stared until his bluster faded. Then came the desperate, pleading apologies. Isadora, it was a sickness. I lost my mind. I'll end it all. I'll go to therapy. We can fix this. His words were empty, pathetic whispers. Finally, the bitter accusations. You're a cold woman. You never loved me. This is what you wanted all along, to destroy me. I let him exhaust himself. When he finally fell silent, breathing heavily, I spoke, my voice quiet and final. You destroyed yourself, Marcus. I just held up the mirror. I had already claimed my power, and his words, whether angry, pleading, or venomous, fell against me like whispers in a hurricane. I was the calm at the center of the storm he had created, and my silence was his sentence. In the wake of the explosion, I did not sift through the rubble of my old life. I surveyed the cleared land and began to build anew, this time according to my own blueprint. The house, once a gilded cage of his secrets, was the first to be transformed. I sold it, every penny of the proceeds, after paying off his secret second mortgage, going into an account bearing only my name. I found a modern, sun-drenched apartment with views of the city skyline, a view that was mine alone to claim. I focused on the finances, working closely with Diana to untangle the last of his web. Every asset was scrutinized, every debt assigned to him. The trust in myself, which he had systematically eroded, became my new foundation. I made decisions without consulting anyone, from major investments to the color of the throw pillows on my new sofa. Every choice, every signed check, every brick I laid in this new life was not an act of recovery, but a declaration of independence and power. The phantom limb of my marriage ceased to ache. In its place was a stronger, more resilient core. My revenge was not celebrated with a triumphant toast or a vindictive social media post. It was marked by the quiet hum of a life lived entirely on my own terms. It was in the peace of a Saturday morning with no tension, no lies hanging in the air. It was in the ability to make plans without the shadow of his betrayal darkening the edges. When mutual friends cautiously brought up his name, telling me he was struggling, that his reputation was in tatters, and his new life was not the paradise he'd imagined, I simply nodded. I offered no sympathy, no schadenfreude. My silence on the matter was more powerful than any curse I could have uttered. The greatest revenge was my palpable, undeniable peace. It was the quiet triumph of someone who had refused to be defined by her victimhood, who had taken the pain and alchemized it into an unshakable sense of self. He had expected a dramatic, emotional wreck. He was confronted with a serene, successful woman who simply no longer had any space for him in her thoughts or her world. With Diana's relentless help, I methodically reorganized the architecture of my life. The divorce settlement was a work of art. He was left with the debts he had accrued, while the solid remaining assets were mine. My financial future was secured, locked down in trusts and investments he could no longer touch. Legally, he was a ghost, his signature meaningless on any document pertaining to me. Emotionally, the severance was just as complete. The love I had once felt was a closed archive, a part of my history with no bearing on my present. He no longer held any control, not over my money, my home, or my heart. My world was no longer ours. It was mine alone, a sovereign state with firmly defended borders, and the peace within them was profound. Karma did not need my help to collect its debt. It moved through the channels of our old life with quiet efficiency. I heard through the gossips, the same ones who had once chronicled our perfect life, that his business was floundering. Clients, wary of the scandal and his now apparent lack of integrity, took their projects elsewhere. The charitable boards he had been so proud to sit on had quietly accepted his resignation and moved on without him. Friends and neighbors who had witnessed his downfall from a distance now offered me warm, respectful smiles, their loyalty having naturally settled with the wronged party who had handled herself with such formidable grace. The smug, unrepentant man had been utterly outplayed and outsmarted, not by a grand scheme, but by the simple, unstoppable force of consequences. His public humiliation was not a single event, but a slow, steady dimming of his light, while mine burned brighter than ever. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, a glass of wine in hand, looking out at the city lights winking in the twilight. The silence was not empty, it was full of promise. I smiled, not at his downfall, but at the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of his betrayal. The pain was a memory, a fossil preserved in the bedrock of who I had become. He had tried to shatter me, to reduce me to a bitter, broken woman, but he had failed. Strength, strategy, and an immense, patient resolve had turned his betrayal into my rebirth. The victory was not in his ruin, but in my renaissance. I was no longer Isadora, the betrayed wife. I was Isadora, the architect of her own destiny. Betrayal doesn't define you, your response does. Karma doesn't always yell. Sometimes it quietly hands the power back to the one they underestimated. I am revenge with Pamela, where every doubt becomes destiny.